Well, Theo, welcome to Director's Notes.
Thank you for having me.
No, you're so welcome. So, just to start off, can you please give us a quick introduction to you and your film?
I'm the director and editor of The Flowers Stand Silently Witnessing. It's an archive essay film that um, explores the filmings of Scottish missionary in Palestine in the 1930s and 40s. And as a half Palestinian, I reclaim that footage and kind of bring it to today as well.
And because I read you're doing a PhD at the
Yeah.
moment. Did you come across this footage from your PhD?
Yeah, so it was I came across it quite accidentally. It wasn't part of what I was researching initially, but it was there. I felt that there was a calling when I found this footage that wasn't digitized yet. So I had found that the archive, which is the National Library of Scotland, which is quite close to where I live in Glasgow. Um, they had footage of Palestine. I was very intrigued. And then when I found out that it wasn't digitized, I felt, oh, that's a beginning of kind of a bigger relationship with the archive. And that's when both the idea of the film began and my focus of the research changed into kind of researching that as well.
Okay, so it all sort of came together.
Yeah.
So were you the one leading the digitization of this?
Yeah, so I think through my research, I collaborated with people from the archive,
Mm,
and because of the way I found out afterwards, the way they work is that only they would digitize archives only if people came to them with the desire to watch them.
okay.
But that was kind of the initial part of the process. But I think for me, as a Palestinian and having this kind of rich footage right next door to me was something that was so precious that I just couldn't deny kind of the need to do something with it, at least to see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it feeds into, because I was looking at sort of your previous works,
Hmm.
it feeds into, things you've done
Yeah.
previously. I was looking at work you've done with Tape Collective,
Yeah.
who we recently interviewed and talking about archival
Yeah.
sort of imagery. So, how did it feel for you just coming upon this? Because it feels there's some serendipity in it.
Yes. Yes. It's I think there's two sides of it. I think there's the one side, the exciting side, and the creative side when you find something so rich and something so I think deep in its exploration. But also I think there is a sense of disappointment when like a document such with such rich background history and beautiful images that I found out later was sitting 70 years just, undiscovered, let's say.
Yeah.
So there's always a tension that I think kind of fed into the film as well, that tension of something so beautiful, but something so forgotten. So yeah, I think that was kind of the initial feeling I had. But
Yeah.
that drove me to really explore that feeling even further. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I want to get into sort of the editing a bit
Yeah.
later, but in the beginning of the film, so
Mhm.
you say this film acts as an intervention of the original footage.
Yeah.
So can you explain sort of what you mean by that?
Mm. So the film is made out of two different archival films that present flowers in Palestine, filmed by a Scottish missionary. So the films themselves are edited works
Yeah.
with a very clear voice and a clear perspective on how both the flowers and the people are seen. And I felt that if made a film out of those archival films, I had to find my own voice within it, and I couldn't just respond to a more kind of colonial way of looking at things, but
Mm.
I needed to, I guess I needed from the very beginning to establish that this is not a response. That's not just a response to the footage, but I'm trying to explore something new through that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so that's, I think, the idea of the intervention and
Okay.
establishing quite early on in the film.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it is, you've created your own original piece.
Yeah.
And when I was watching it, it's one I was watching over and over again. There's quite a haunting flow to it.
Hmm.
The beginning, it's beautiful. It's this young family, they're having a lovely picnic.
Yeah.
And then it sort of moves on, and then you've got the second part of the film, and then you've got more capturing of the home and people's land, and then the observation changes.
Mm-hmm.
The sort of yeah. So could you talk us through that flow and how you wanted it to move so much?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that came from the editing process because it took me 6 months to figure out what the story would be because you might have your own opinions and thoughts on looking at the footage, but at the end of the day, you need to tell a story.
Mm,
And I felt that the way in the story always needed to be the white Scottish people who were in the footage. And I think that was, I guess, the tension I had when I first watched the footage. It was maybe 4 months after I discovered the archive that I got the digital footage. Um, and what struck me was the disparity of time. I guess how much you get to see Scottish people in the archive and how kind of I guess how the Arab Palestinians in the film are so put in the side. They are not part of the narrative that the
no.
missionary is creating. So for me, that was the clear tension that I felt watching it. So I felt that by starting and exploring those moments of the Scottish people in Palestine in the 30s, and then changing that context slowly throughout the film of where they are, what's the time, how do I look at it? People could, I guess, feel how I feel when watching the footage. And yeah, I felt um, at some point once I started looking closer to the Arab Palestinians in the footage, there needed to be some shift within the film
Yeah.
and do the full intervention and reclamation as I always wanted to do. Uh,
Yeah.
so I guess that was the three act structure that was created throughout the process. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you've got those beautiful moments where you sort of cut to stills of the Arab Palestinians and especially the children. And they're often, because at the beginning they're very blurred. You can't,
Yeah.
because as you say, it's very much through a colonizer's eye. They're just in the background.
Yeah.
And then when you focus on them, and then you've got those beautiful stills of their faces. How did those develop?
I think that came out of a very organic process through the editing because I came in the footage wanting to find those people because I felt, oh, they are my ancestors. I want to see them, and you rarely get a kind of such a clear document of their lives, even if it's problematic. But just the fact that it was in the 30s and in color that created a sense of urgency in looking and witnessing. Um, so for me, it came organically because I was zooming in through the footage during the edit, and there were moments that hit me quite hard, and those are the moments I put in the film.
Yeah.
When I would edit and something would happen within the film, either that would be a very harsh cut that the missionary would do through his edit, um, right when maybe a Palestinian person would look at the camera, he would cut, or there would be moments where I found them so beautiful, just in their simplicity, just maybe a boy holding some flowers and walking through a field. So there were things that just hit me quite hard, um, especially in a time of grief as well, where you see something so beautiful, but also you're grieving of the present.
Mm.
There's that kind of, again, that tension of that beauty and that violence that is constantly within the same frame. Um, so that's, I think, that was kind of the process of discovering the language of the film, of something that feels so beautiful, but also so melancholic because you know what
Yeah.
happens later. Uh,
Yeah.
and I think that that sense of knowing because of our present, I think gives a lot more meaning in the film that maybe you wouldn't have at that time. Yeah,
There's so much, and I think when I was watching it as well, it's just those beautiful moments of innocence,
yeah, yeah,
and then obviously knowing what is happening right now.
yeah.
That's what feels so impactful.
Mm,
Knowing that you can't go to Palestine right now and find you wouldn't be able to film any footage like that.
yeah,
And you were obviously making this and editing this during, the most horrific period.
yeah.
How is that for you as a creator, as a filmmaker?
Yeah, I don't think I'm supposed to be doing that in a way. I don't think this is supposed to be happening in the first place. So I think that's um, not something humanly possible to even process. But I think personally, I always want to be doing films that are speaking about things that are happening in the present, even if you're looking 100 years in the past, and using films as kind of both as an intervention, but also as a way of engaging politically with our life and our world around us. Um, so for me, there was an urgency of doing something about it, even though I started that project before October. So
Mm.
I had this idea from the summer, but it had just a different angle. But once uh, the violence began, um, I felt a responsibility to engage with that directly, um, by looking at the past. So I feel it's just the way that time is not so linear and things
Yeah,
repeat themselves, and there's a cyclical kind of way of unfolding that I also found interesting within the film, because during the editing I would have my phone on the side and I would have those horrific images from Gaza, and then I would be editing those beautiful images of Tiberias where the film is set, and there will be constantly that back and forth of images essentially, and me kind of doing similar things that they might be doing from Gaza who are filming the atrocities. So there was definitely, I feel, a dialogue with the
yeah,
present. And I think that's why I felt they need to also bring it in the film even slightly, just through the titles, just to bring, I guess, a second level of documentation within the film. Yeah.
yeah. I wanted to ask you and talk about the titles because there's very few of them, but they're extremely impactful.
Mhm.
Were those written by you?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And how did you work out the pacing of them?
Mm. Yeah, that's a good question. I feel, yeah, I was very, I guess in the beginning I had this idea of a voiceover that comes, automatically. As in my previous film, I always had voiceover, but
Mm.
I felt I didn't want to intervene that much into the way that audiences might experience the images, and that the images are so rich where they kind of speak on their own as well, even though you need to facilitate them in a certain way. But I feel the titles had to be extremely, I had to be very kind of sensitive in the way I would place them, because I could notice that if I would say something, it would completely change the way you would look at the next image. Um, so I realized that I was playing a lot with that idea of looking and how does looking change when you get another information, or I guess
Mm,
you get the information of who's editing that image. Um, and what does it mean to be having that image edited by me, for example? Or in another, or there are certain information that I think adds in the relationship of the Arab Palestinians with the missionary without really being so direct about it, in the way that from 45 minutes of footage, there were just 2 minutes of Arab Palestinians in the film.
yeah,
So I
yeah.
think I wanted to have this sense of, obviously there's the sense of a slow pace that is very kind of specific in its rhythm that leads somewhere, in a certain climax that is coming. But yeah, I wanted to be also extremely specific in what I say and how I write it as well.
Mm, mm. I think, but it does it, the emotional beats that sort of come from that,
Mhm.
you can really feel them. Um, and yeah, I think narration would have completely
Yeah,
changed the way that I watched the film and the way that I processed it. Because as you said, then I don't know, it's more subjectified with narration.
yeah.
And then obviously the only other sort of thing we've got is the music, very sort of gentle,
Mhm.
nature-filled, melody. Did you know exactly what you wanted to put behind that?
Um, I think there was a sense I had in the emotion I wanted to bring through it, but I worked with a sound designer called Hanan Jones in the first two-thirds of the film, and a composer called Alexandra Katerinopoulou in the last third of the film. And I felt there was a need to explore something that was abstract and not really understood fully, because I think there was something I felt within the archive where I cannot really access everything I need to access, intellectually as well as spatially, where I just cannot look right because the missionary looks left, for example. Um, so I decided, or I guess we collaborated and we found this language of using the metaphor of the seeds underground as something that people cannot really control. And when they're trying to control everything else, that's something that is still, it has its own agency. And I
Yeah,
think that was the metaphor that we were trying to create, but in a way that isn't that clear as well. That even us as an audience, we are not really sure what we are listening to. Um, and then throughout the film, those seeds are kind of very aggressively coming out of the earth, and that's kind of the music. Working with the really good kind of flute person. It's a ney, which is a Middle Eastern flute. So
okay.
everything was very specifically designed. But for me, the most important was the sense of emotion through all those elements, because for me, that's what makes a film kind of resonate with people, and with myself first. So yeah, I felt that power that the flute had at the end really kind of captured the way I felt when I would see people looking back at me from the past to the present.
Yeah.
Um, and I wanted somehow to have that part of the film as well.
Yeah. And you spoke about, the three act structure that you
Mm,
created,
mhm.
but there was obviously so much of this footage.
Yeah,
This could have easily been a much longer film.
yeah.
Was it a challenge to condense it and put it into what is it, 17 minutes or something runtime?
Mm.
Because I could have watched it for hours. I really could.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think with archive repurposing, I always had the same length of time. I just didn't really know how to structure it because you start from scratch essentially. And there's so many ways and so many approaches that other filmmakers have followed in using archives. So I felt through the edit, it was easy to get lost in what you were saying because there were so many voices even within the archive itself. Um, so I felt the my challenge was to find my own voice within the archive, which I think was quite difficult. Um, and not and I felt for the longest of times the voice of the missionary was stronger than mine
Okay.
because he had edited and filmed it. So it felt
Yeah.
I was the editor to his directing for a long time. And I think the moment that it shifted is when I realized that his footage had to be um, engaged as if they are raw footage, as if it isn't an edit, and it's just
Mm.
footage that I've received through a shoot somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think at that point,
Just got the rushes.
exactly, exactly, where things don't have a specific structure, they're random, and you can start from the beginning in thinking what the film is about.
Mm.
And at that point, which was maybe it was a month before completing the film, it just clicked to me, and then everything kind of fell in place, which is beautiful when that happens in filmmaking, because it's always in your mind, but once there's a click, then everything kind of automatically kind of, yeah, it goes perfectly where it needs to be.
Yeah. You need that magic moment.
Exactly.
And then the film, so it was commissioned by Screen Scotland.
Yes. It was through the Scottish documentary scheme called Bridging the Gap, which is
Mm.
for emerging documentary filmmaker in Scotland, which is supported by, yeah, Scottish Documentary Institute and Screen Scotland. So that was the first. It's a really great opportunity for Scotland-based documentary filmmakers to get that first opportunity in making a documentary with a very creative and supportive team as well. Uh,
Yeah.
so yeah, it was a really great opportunity to go through them because the once I applied with the archive, I didn't have a really clear idea of what the story was, and through the scheme, really that I kind of found my voice also throughout it. So yeah,
Yeah. And this must have been quite a sort of solitary project. You've not got a massive crew and a huge film set.
yeah.
Is that a way you like to work, or was that specific to this film?
I tend to be very collaborative, and I don't like working on my own. Uh, but I think this was a very specific type of project where it just needed me to be present with the material,
Mm.
not just spending time with it, but emotionally kind of being open to it at this very specific time. So I felt it was more of an exception to the rule. But still, I felt I worked in very big ways with a couple of collaborators, either that was sound design, music composing, script consulting, even the smallest of contributions really led me to a very big breakthrough through the film. So I wouldn't be able to do that on my own. But yeah, I think it was an exception in the way that I normally work with, which is with many people, uh,
Yeah.
and getting as much feedback as possible as well.
And the film is, I mean, it's still quite new.
Yeah.
You've got your North America premiere next week.
Yeah.
It's still setting out, and obviously you've been nominated for the BAFTA. But I want to know what feedback and what conversations this has sparked so far.
Mhm. Yeah, it is quite early to be fair.
It's
But
amazing.
yeah, it's really exciting that it's been embraced so early in the process. I've had only two screenings, or I guess two festivals,
Hmm.
but it's very interesting because lots of people have very different perspectives on the film, and I've gotten a lot of interesting ways of seeing the footage, which I think works perfectly with what the film is saying, which is about looking in different ways. And I think that translates also to audiences in how they see it, maybe what's their background, how do they relate with the footage or with the people in the footage or even with the flowers. Um, so I feel the film is kind of bigger than me in a way where I said something in the film, but then the film says much more than what I intend to.
Yeah,
Uh, so I think this is really a blessing in a way because I can also watch the film as something else and not just as my creation. Um,
yeah,
so that's always the best thing to happen, I think, for a filmmaker.
yeah. A
Yeah,
film should take on its own life.
exactly, exactly.
Um, yeah, I think that's really important. And even now, I'm looking forward to watching it again after speaking to you.
Mhm.
And just thinking about that now and what you're saying, one of the moments that struck me is he's filming a missionary, and I think he's looking, I don't know if it's an instrument for milling or something. It's this big
Yeah,
concrete stone circle. Yeah, I was just thinking about that image, and it's just that it's that observation, isn't it? It's like, oh, look at these people and look at what they've done, and isn't it amazing? And I'm gonna show a film of it
yeah,
whilst I'm taking over their country.
yeah. And
Um,
it's also the fact that this mill is kind of thousands of years old.
yeah,
So you only look only a thousand years before, but not in the present and in the environment you're around. So that was a
yeah,
very specific moment where he's looking at the mill, but there's a boy behind him that he doesn't look at, and I think that's definitely what the film is really about. Who do you decide to look at, and who do you decide to take out of the frame as well?
yeah, yeah. And that just came to me as well as we were talking.
Yeah.
So that's beautiful. I can imagine. Yeah, and I mean, so the BAFTA nomination, how does that feel? Because again, as we said, it's you've had two screenings.
Yes.
It's phenomenal.
Yeah, it was very unexpected to be honest, because I feel I'm in the beginning of this process of sharing the film, and it seems that the film is being seen without me knowing it's being seen. So I'm really excited to have it seen in the cinema with an audience and get that sense of, yeah, kind of a collective experience as well of watching it. And also as a document itself is always really beautiful to see it kind of expand in a big screen because you
Yeah,
normally see it in a computer or a phone.
of course.
So that's also quite important, yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I feel this is a film that will play, and it'll be one of those that you'll just hear nothing. You know, when you hear an audience go
Yes, yes.
silent,
Yeah.
nobody's reaching for their popcorn, nobody's doing anything. I think you're going to have a lot of those screenings. And how is sort of everything going with your PhD? And that's feeding into your filmmaking. And, do you know what you're going to focus on next?
I think, yeah, I'm currently, yeah, with my PhD, I'm exploring the same collection, but it's 12 films instead of two. So there's a lot of material for sure. So I'm in discussions now of maybe expanding the film into a longer feature, because there's so much material in so many different parts of Palestine where the missionary was filming, and knowing more about kind of his family, what he was doing there, as well as getting more footage of Palestine and Palestinians as well. So I think it's a long-term project that this is
Yeah.
just the beginning for sure. And through my
Yeah.
PhD, I'm also working on that. So I think there is a lot to do for sure. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And this just came to me. Do you know who the missionary is?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's called Herbert Torrens. And I think there are some descendants in Scotland at the moment, which might be grandchildren in their 70s
Okay.
or 80s. So um, he was, I think, during the filming of that footage, he was already in his 40s. So yeah, we have to go quite yeah, it's
Yeah, there's a few
there are a few
generations.
few generations afterwards. So yeah, I'm really excited to get to know more about it, but also to share this archive with other similar kind of initiatives. Especially
Mm,
there are a lot of Palestinians and in the diaspora in Palestine that they're trying to archive and to tell a story that is so fragmented. And I feel this is just one initiative out of so
yeah,
many. So for me, I
yeah,
think the ideal thing would be to connect with others and just kind of be part of this bigger project.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. These need to be shown. These
Yes.
these these archives are so
Yeah.
important.
Thank
And just congratulations on everything. The film is stunning.
thank you. Thank you so much.
No, you're welcome, and I wish you the best of luck next week.
Thank you. Yeah. That'd be exciting. Yeah.
That'll be big.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's your big one. And then obviously for the BAFTAs.
Yes. Yes. I take it one step at a time. Yeah.
Yeah, one day at a time. That's the only
Exactly.
way to go.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me.
Thank you for inviting me for sure.